Hello, my name is Joseph Irshetta, and I'm doing this video for the Smiling Brown Project. Just wanted to share with you some of my thoughts growing up. Um, I'm Mexican American, second generation, grew up in Chicago in the inner city housing projects, and a lot of this is about the negotiation of identity. Um, Many of the stories that you'll hear are negotiations of identity that are from the outside, having to do with the people you interact with and the definitions that they have about you or your group of people, and whether or not you fit into those categories. For myself, my neighborhood was mostly African American and Puerto Rican, and a few white folks. But in terms of skin color, I was never made to feel ashamed of my skin color um, at all by anyone. I mean, there are a few instances here and there, but I think that from birth through college, I went away through my life pretty unscathed by racism. At least it wasn't uh, it wasn't overt. I didn't feel that it was directed directly at me. Um, so what I mean by negotiating your identity, um, I'm talking about um, as you go through and you start to discover who you are or who you want to be, that sometimes you'll be met with pushback from a different group. So as I was young, um, I mean, it wasn't a bad experience. My friends who were African American thought I was Chinese or Japanese or Hawaiian or something like that. Um, my face was a different conformation now. Now I have a larger nose, and my nose used to be flatter and wider across my face, and my eyes were more crescent shaped. And then with Puerto Ricans and the other Latinos that moved into the neighborhood, um, I was called Indio or Indigena, and that was not a compliment. Um, and I never knew why it was that we were the only Mexican family in the neighborhood. I wasn't sure why Mexicans were so looked down upon by other Latino groups. Um, and I have ideas about that, but I don't know that they're correct. But then, as I grew up, um, like I said, that wasn't a major part of my experience. But as I grew up, I did meet somebody who was in the opposite situation to me, and he was Puerto Rican who grew up in an all Mexican neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. So that him and I bonded over those kinds of issues. Um, and then in college, I married a white woman, and my daughter is half white, and had a little bit of trouble with the family, but it was mostly religion. I was Catholic, not that I was brown or that I was Mexican, and um, a little bit less than enthusiastic support of myself wanting to be a physician. I wanted to be a physician, and my mother-in-law told me that she, as a white lady, would never go to a Hispanic or a Mexican doctor, even though at that time Hindu doctors were quite prevalent in the Chicago area. Um, there's only a few times where I got called the N word, but they were visiting people to Chicago from the South, from North Carolina or from South Carolina. Um, and then around 32 years old, I moved to Wisconsin, and many of the Native Americans were mistaking me for an American Indian. And you guys probably know that we are indigenous, but for Mexicans, we have a 300 to 250 longer history with dealing with European settler colonialists than the people in the north. And so we negotiate our indigenous identity differently. So I remember growing up, my grandmother saying that that we were Indian. We had Indian stuff all over the house. We had statues, and we had posters, and we had calendars from the panaderia and all that kind of thing that had pictures of Mexican Indians on it. And so I asked, I said, "Are we Indian?" And she said, uh, "Well, you know how white people used to be cavemen? Well, we used to be Indian." And so, as I was in Wisconsin getting mistaken, and many of the elders in Wisconsin and Wyoming and Minnesota and Idaho and different places would welcome me to their bosom by giving me a hug, and welcome me to their kitchen by giving me food. Um, I did find some pushback with other Native Americans not accepting me as Native, and I think that's partly because of a lot of us Mexicans, due to the Porfiriato, the Porfirio Diaz, don't consider ourselves American Indian. Because under the reign of Porfirio Diaz, we were basically killed if you identified that way. And my family was no exception, but my family mostly comes from the Altiplano, so Michoacan, Jalisco, and Guanajuato, which is a very indigenous area, and I have one grandparent from Chihuahua. And so I started looking more into my native roots. Before that, I didn't want to speak Spanish. It's not that I didn't really want to be Mexican. I didn't flee from my skin color. It was more that I wanted the things I saw on TV, the lives of white people that I saw on TV. But I started investigating the history of Mexico and the history of Spain and the history of North America, and I became more um, engaged with my indigeneity. And so today I work with American Indian tribes to try and ensure that their research is something that's going to benefit them. And I was a high school teacher for a couple of different American Indian high schools, and they also have trouble managing their indigeneity. Um, when I first started teaching them, they wanted to be like the African American kids in the gangs in the inner cities, and then later it evolved. They wanted to be more like the Mexican gangs from the inner cities, and they mixed the symbols, and they mixed the songs, and they mixed the clothing, and they did a lot of different. They didn't want to be who they were, but it didn't have anything to do with skin color. Um, the only thing that I can remember in terms of skin color specifically is that I got stories from relatives how it wasn't good to be a darker skin, but my family in particular, we didn't have that, because I was the son of a only son in the family, and so he was quite favored. So even though me and my sisters were all darker and looked more indigenous, um, we didn't get any flack from the family because of who my father was. Plus, we had quite a lot of pride in my family about who we were. We were hard workers. We were all pretty well educated, um, and uh, no matter where we went, we ended up being the spokespeople for different issues. Um, but in terms of skin color for the American Indian children that I work with, the darker ones would say they would have to stay out of the sun in the summertime, so that by the time September rolled around, when school started, the people who were mixed, half or a quarter native, they'd all end up being the same color on the first day of school. Again, I never experienced that. In fact, when I came out to Indian country, it was the opposite. I was having contests with Native Americans about who can get browner, who can get darker. Um, it's kind of a little jab at legitimacy, because as you know, probably there's kind of a native revival, and some of that's bad because um, they're disenrolling natives from their tribe, but in a way it's good because they're more proud and less ashamed of being indigenous looking. Um, so these negotiations of identity are very personal. It depends on who you are and who your family is, and mine didn't ever seem to be from the outside. In fact, at airports and other places, I kind of look for confrontations, but I never find any. I don't know if it's because of the way I speak, or maybe because of the way I look, but I rarely find any confrontation with non-brown or black people. The white people treat me fairly decently, and if they don't, I immediately challenge them. And so I don't really negotiate in terms of skin color or ethnicity even. Um, but I guess my point is that sometimes this idea of being proud of who you are is internal, or very close to being internal, which is your family. Um, I know of lots of Mexican or Latino girls, especially, who are not favored by their moms because they are darker compared to their sisters. I never had that experience, neither did my sisters. Um, and like I said, for me, mine was internal, and it wasn't because I was running away from skin color. I was running toward what I thought was a better life, which you see on TV with the Brady Bunch and um, shows where it's an all-white cast living in a nice upper-class suburban neighborhood. But now I've got a master's degree in pharmaceutics, and I'm working on a PhD in environmental health. Um, and even though I still have a modest existence, I I'm not chasing anything except for uh, more experiences with my own people and with other native people, and trying to revitalize indigenous languages and communities. So with that, thank you very much.